At the beginning of the 20th century, the mysterious and unique Russian nation witnessed the end of one of the oldest Christian empires, still standing hand in hand. The world's first successful communist revolution happened in that state, the largest on the planet. The last man to rule this empire was Tsar Nikolai. For some, a tyrant who kept the population hungry, but for others, a leader who pushed Russia to become a world power, and whose story has been unfairly distorted by the victors of history. What was the life of Nikolai Romanov and his empire like? What is false and manipulated about his story and the powers that conspired to overthrow him? Join us to learn about this story, up to the tragic end of the Romanov family and their 5 children in the depths of an unknown basement. My name is Alessandro Polentino, and this is the New Encyclopedia. Before we begin today's story, we want to invite you to support our channel, to subscribe, to leave your like, to leave your comments, we read them all, to share our videos with each of your friends, and to turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Now, without anything else to add, let's begin today's story. Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov, known in Spanish as Nicholas Romanov, was born on May 18, 1868, in the Alexander Palace, located in the majestic village of the Aries, on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, in what was then the Russian Empire. Little Nikolai is the grandson of the then Tsar, or Emperor Alexander III of Russia, while his father is the Tsarevich, that is, Prince, also named Alexander, who in the not-too-distant future will become Tsar Alexander III. Nikolai is a member of the Romanov dynasty, that is, the royal family that has been ruling the Russian Empire with an iron fist since 1613. The Russian Empire at that time was a great nation that stretched from Eastern Europe to the frozen Siberia, and it has its distant origins in the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which emerged after the fragmentation of the old Star of Kievan Rus and the end of Mongol rule in the region in the 13th century. With the consolidation of his power under Ivan III in the 15th century, the Grand Duchy of Moscow began to unify all the scattered territories around it, establishing an autocracy with strong roots in the Orthodox Christian religion and based on a feudal social structure with a powerful nobility and peasants closely tied to the land, which lays the foundation for the autocracy, empire, and nation that emerged from Mongol rule in the 16th century and part of the 17th century, under emblematic figures such as Ivan the Terrible, considered the first Tsar of Russia, and Mikhail Romanov, who founded that dynasty and was its first Tsar. The emerging Russian state continued to expand its borders eastward, conquering Kazan and Astrakhan, and extending into Siberia, which gives the emerging empire a rich cultural diversity spans from Slavic peoples such as Russians to nomadic groups like the Mongols. Later, in the 18th century, Pyotr the Great, upon coming to power, formalized the constitution of the Russian Empire in 1721. This happened after the victories in the so-called Great Northern Wars. During his lifetime, Pyotr implemented broad administrative, military, and cultural reforms based on Western models of the time in order to modernize and strengthen the country's state structure. At the same time, under the reign of Pyotr the Great, the capital of the empire was moved to St. Petersburg, a symbol of Russia's openness and westernization. However, despite the great modernization, Russian society maintained its historical social structure. That is, the nobility owned the land and the peasants worked it under conditions that varied depending on the era. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Russian Empire expanded territorially into regions such as Poland, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Alaska, consolidating its status as a great global power, vast in size but lagging in economic and social development. When compared to the West of the 18th centuries and the Russian Empire, Poland, the Caucasus, its status as a great power, its vast size. But compared to the West throughout the 18th centuries and the Russian Empire, it expanded territorially into new regions. Its status and size grew, but it was economically backward when compared to the West. An empire that, moreover, remained one of the few confessional states in the world, and where traditional political and social structures were maintained. This was in a world in Europe filled with republics and parliamentary monarchies. That's why new currents of thought, such as liberalism, socialism, anarchism, communism, and many others, began to penetrate various sectors of society. And that, in a not-so-distant future, will forever change the social dynamics of the empire. This is the historical moment when our protagonist, Nikolai Romanov, is born. In a few years, he will inherit the power of the Russian Empire. This is the historical moment when the protagonist is born. Nikolai receives a privileged cosmopolitan education from private tutors. They combine not only elements of history, culture, politics, law, military art, and Russian literature, but also delve into these same aspects of other countries, such as France and England. And even Nikolai goes to Japan and India for educational purposes. Regarding his distinct personality, which he will maintain throughout his life, Nikolai is characterized by his shyness, his kindness, and his deep devotion to the Orthodox Christian faith, his gentleness, his formality in all kinds of relationships, and his fondness for theater plays, military marches, water sports, and romantic literature. So according to several testimonies, the future Tsar proved to be a very endearing person, simple, hardworking, and responsible. At 13, after his grandfather was assassinated by Russian far-left militants on March 13, 1881, and with his father's ascension to the throne as Alexander III, Nikolai became the Tsarevich, that is, the Prince of the Russian Empire. During his reign, Alexander III, in contrast to the liberalizing work of his father, undertook a series of reforms that strengthened the autocratic power of the Tsar. Regarding the events that surrounded his father's death. In this sense, Alexander III strengthened the imperial secret police, known as the Okhrana, to pursue and neutralize various socialist and revolutionary movements, which further heightens tensions in the empire. For his part in the economic field, Alexander III took measures that continued the steady economic growth of the empire, such as protecting Russian industry from foreign industry and international markets. Austerity in the imperial court, the increase of gold reserves, and the strengthening of the national currency. These aspects allow a large part of the Russian population, both peasants and non-peasants, to start coming out of poverty. His Royal Highness Alexander III passed away prematurely on November 1st, 1894, due to nephritis. This means that Tsarevich Nikolai, who was 26 years old at the time, now had to assume the position of Emperor of all the Russias. In a nation of 23 million square kilometers and home to no less than 125 million people. But little did the new Tsar and all of Russia know that the future held a difficult path for him. Crowned as Tsar, on May 26, 1894, Nikolai ascended to the imperial throne as Nikolai the Free Versailles. After his coronation, on November 26, 1894, he married Alex of Hesse, a Bet, a noble German girl who would always be the absolute and immaculate love of the young Tsar. After converting to the Orthodox faith, Alex takes the name Alexandra Fyodorovna Romanova and automatically becomes the Empress Consort of Russia. Nicholas Tvrtosai has descendants with Empress Alexandra. The first is Olga, born in 1895. Then comes Tatiana, born in 1897, Maria, in 1899, Anastasia in 1901, and little Alexei in August 1904, giving the Russian imperial family a Tsarevich, or prince, to succeed his father. Going back to Nikolai in his early years as Tsar, he would confess on several occasions that he did not feel ready to be Tsar, believing that he did not have the necessary skills to rule. This, combined with his character not being as strong as his father's. According to some historians, this explains why the Tsar was influenced by the opinions of the imperial court from the very beginning. And what about his cousins in Western Europe, like King George V of England and Kaiser Wilhelm III of Germany? At first, the Tsar continued to strengthen the monarchical power initiated by his father, so he restricted the growing demands of broad reformist sectors. This caused particular discontent among the members of the so-called Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, founded by several Russian Jews in 1898, as the gathering of all leftist factions in Russia with the express goal of overthrowing the monarchy in that country. A singular figure stands out in this movement, whose fate will later become intertwined with that of Tsar Nikolai. We're talking about Vladimir Lenin, who during these years is devoted to intense intellectual training within the ranks of Russian Marxism. And he is emerging as a leader of this cause, using journalistic propaganda that will resonate with various sectors of society. About Vladimir Lenin, Leninism, and his role in the fall of the Russian Empire and the rise of the Soviet Union. We have an interesting video on our channel where we share little-known facts about that revolutionary leader. But going back to the facts, in economic terms, the first years of Tsar Nikolai II were marked by sustained growth of the Russian economy, with a rate of 2%, thanks to events such as the beginning of large-scale mining and oil exploitation, and the formal introduction of the ruble as a stable national currency. This economic stability allowed Tsar Nikolai to achieve important accomplishments, such as the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway and thousands of educational centers, which led to an increase in literacy, the promotion of arts and culture in several cities across the country, and the achievement of the first important steps in labor law and social security. However, this situation changed drastically with the start of the Russo-Japanese War in September 1904, which began due to the clash between Russian and Japanese territorial expansion. In the region of Manchuria, located in the far east of Asia, the exhausting war disrupted Russia's economic stability and affected several sectors of the population. These groups began a strong protest in St. Petersburg on January 22, 1905, which headed toward the Winter Palace, the official residence of the Tsar. In a short time, this protest was harshly repressed by the Tsar's forces, so much so that this day would later be called Bloody Sunday, and the situation quickly degenerated into violence, strikes, and demonstrations not only in St. Petersburg, but throughout the country in the following months. This fact is cleverly taken advantage of by the leftists, who intend to turn the protests into a revolution aimed at overthrowing the monarchy. However, this attempt at revolution ends up being rather brief, because since 1903 the leftists were divided between the Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov, who believed in a socialist revolution, but in a gradual way. And in contrast to them were the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, who was temporarily abroad, and who believed in a radical socialist revolution. Thus, without an organization or clear leadership, the events of 1905 dragged on for several months, without achieving any significant accomplishments for either the Mensheviks or the Bolsheviks. Under pressure, Tsar Nikolai issues the October Manifesto. At the end of that month, in the year 1905, he formalizes peace with Japan and ends the Manchuria conflict, among other things. In addition, he sanctions freedoms such as religious freedom, freedom of association, and freedom of expression, and also guarantees several rights such as the right to assembly and expression. But more significantly, the Tsar creates the so-called Imperial Duma, which will be a kind of parliament elected by universal male suffrage, through which all laws had to pass before their approval, and in which all political parties, from the left to the right, could participate. These measures led to the end of the unrest that had been taking place since January, which would later become known as the Russian Revolution of 1905. However, these same measures, described as open-minded by historians, were received in different ways in Russian politics. While they are accepted by the Mensheviks and other gradualist groups, the Bolsheviks do not look favorably upon them and continue to conspire against the Tsar. These conspiracies were initially channeled through the Soviets, which were popular assemblies created by the express order of Tsar Nikolai to converse and mediate directly with the workers. The St. Petersburg Soviet, the first to be formed and the most powerful of its time. It came to have more than 220,000 workers and was quickly controlled by a mix of workers' leaders, some Mensheviks, others Bolsheviks, and a few socialist revolutionaries. In a short time, the St. Petersburg Soviet became a governing body. Parallel to the Russian state, it organizes dangerous strikes, creates workers' patrols, and controls industry, the mail, and even the city supply. These events are seen by Tsar Nikolai as dangerous, and he orders the dissolution of the St. Petersburg Soviet on December 3, 1905, which of course happens in a very violent, radical, and repressive way. In this sense, Tsar Nikolai understands that, despite the freedoms granted as a result of the October Manifesto, he must be the one who holds the de facto power in the country. That way, he can prevent its collapse. In this sense, in May 1906, the Russian Constitution of 1906 was enacted, which defines the empire as a constitutional monarchy and reaffirms the authority of the Tsar above the Imperial Duma. The ministerial cabinet, appointed by him in practically all the organs of the state, having the power to approve, modify, and repeal laws without any restriction. In this way, once the Constitution was enacted, elections were held to form the First Imperial Duma for the period 1906-1911. However, this Duma was dissolved 10 weeks after its election, as it was not possible to reconcile the representatives' positions, because in the Duma, there were people from the most radical left through a more moderate center to the staunchest conservatives. Therefore, the Imperial Duma was dissolved and reinstated about 3 times in the following years, until it finally came under the control of conservative parties, aligned with the policies of preserving the traditional and constitutional public order of Tsar Nikolai. In this context, the revolutionaries of 1905 divided and defeated, took different paths. Lenin's Bolsheviks organized clandestinely inside and outside Russia to carry out a future violent revolution, while the Mensheviks, led by Leon Trotsky, participated in Russian politics, and they focused on consolidating a mass party with a broad worker-peasant base in line with their ideas of gradual struggle. In this sense, what some refer to as, quote, the height of Tsar Nikolai, unquote, begins, well, with control of the Duma, the ministerial cabinet, and the military and police forces. He has concentrated all the power of the nation in himself. However, this fact is not synonymous with political stability, since in the years following 1906, workers' and peasants' mobilizations multiplied. Strikes and protests, and with them, violent clashes with the public order forces. Nevertheless, surprisingly, despite these events, Russia continues with a rapid rate of industrial and economic growth, which places it on par with several powers such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany. This fact explains, as we will see later, the collaboration of these powers with the revolutionaries. Returning to the events, a major occurrence breaks into the history of Russia and Europe when in July 1914 the First World War breaks out. A beginning. Tsar Nikolai wanted to avoid entering the war, knowing the internal and external dangers that would be unleashed. He faced pressure from many people, including neighbors, allies, government officials, and even his wife Alexandra. Therefore, Russia officially enters the World War on August 1, 1914, facing the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, a country that at that time was closely helping Vladimir Lenin, with asylum and money to pull the strings of the Bolsheviks in order to destabilize Russia and create the perfect environment for a revolution. Advised by his wife, the Tsar assumes the general command of the army and heads to the western borders to lead the war operations. As a result, Empress Alexandra, who was very unpopular with the people, took charge of the imperial government, not only because of her German origins, but also because of her friendship with the mystic Grigory Rasputin, who had a strong influence in the last years of Tsarism. During her role as ruler, Empress Alexandra made a series of questionable decisions, such as appointing inexperienced ministers who were close to her, and many times she did, and a Germany that in destabilizing Russia and Germany, that in the name of destabilizing Russia, Germany, going back to the World War. Despite the initial victories from May 1915 onwards, Russia faces successive defeats that result in thousands of deaths and lost resources. At the same time, it suffers major territorial setbacks, losing Galicia, Poland, and part of Belarus from its control. At the same time, the economy, which had previously been booming, now contracts to alarming levels, reflected in sharp inflation and food shortages. This, combined with the intense anti-Tsarist propaganda from Lenin's revolutionaries, accelerates the discontent against the monarchy. So, on January 22, 1917 in St. Petersburg, which at that time changed its name to Petrograd, a massive strike of more than 137,000 workers takes place in commemoration of Bloody Sunday in 1905. Immediately after, during February and March, the situation worsens with the critical shortage and the closing of bakeries, which generates collective hysteria and multiplies the protests with the slogan, open quotes, "Down with the war, down with the monarchy," close quotas. Between March 80 International Women's Day and March 9, over 240,000 people reportedly mobilized across Petrograd. These people, although mostly workers, also include numerous members of the government, university students, public employees, and people from the middle class. Is the imperial aristocracy unhappy with the situation? In addition, another relevant aspect of the events of March 8 and 9 is that the Cossacks, a military corps parallel to the police in Russia, far from repressing the demonstrations, they actually helped the protesters carry out these protests without attacking them at all. These are the definitive signs of the so-called February Revolution, a new social outbreak that, like in 1905, had been spontaneous. Tsar Nikolai leading the war in Mogilov in Belarus. He is completely unaware of the situation since he is not informed by the authorities in Petrograd, who constantly hesitate about what to do in the face of the demonstrations. This situation of social unrest is taken advantage of by the Bolsheviks, who on March 10 deploy an entire machinery of agitators and propagandists to redirect the social upheaval toward their interests. At the same time, on that March 10, the first deaths occur due to skirmishes between the Cossacks, supporters of the demonstrators, and the police, tied to the Tsar and unleashed by the inaction of the Cossacks. By the night of March 10, the Tsar, having learned of everything, orders all revolts and demonstrations to be suppressed. And that's exactly what the authorities in Petrograd do, arresting hundreds of revolutionaries, mobilizing soldiers, machine guns, and armored vehicles, and publishing 2 proclamations. One where they threaten to send protesters who don't return to their jobs to the war front, and another where they ban public gatherings under threat of using force. Despite the early success of these measures, by noon on March 11, the situation becomes tense again. But this time, clashes between protesters and the police cause more than 150 civilian casualties, which further heightens tensions and leads the protesters, after a march, to seize by force a large amount of war material from the imperial arsenals of Itini and Esnoy. At the same time, they also take control of numerous weapons and ammunition factories. The danger was imminent. The protesters, now over 500 soldiers, are heavily armed. In fact, it is estimated that 4 out of every 10 protesters had at least one weapon, which is why the protesters quickly proceeded to take over prisons, factories, businesses, and government buildings. Another factor that led to the rapid fall of the government in Petrograd was its own hesitation. Well, due to various disputes and conflicting interests, some members of the government made Tsar Nicholas, whose attitude in Mogilev in Belarus was quite unconcerned, believe that everything was under control. As a result, there was no quick and forceful reaction against the protesters. This, in turn, led to the withdrawal of support from the military forces stationed in the city, who ended up joining the protesters, who had now become armed revolutionaries. Finally, after having taken control of Petrograd by March 14, the revolutionaries organized a provisional government made up of bourgeois, liberals, laborists, and Mensheviks for the preservation of the revolutionaries' power. And at the same time, the Petrograd Soviet is established, a workers' organization that in the following months will match and surpass the provisional government in power. In view of this whole situation, Tsar Nikolai abdicates on March 15, 1917 in the city of Tino, near the Magwilov headquarters. Initially, the Tsar abdicates in favor of his son, young Alexei, who is only 12, but due to his delicate health, he then abdicates in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail, but he does not accept the crown. Thus, without a successor, the Romanov dynasty comes to an end after nearly 3 centuries of rule over all of Russia. And with the Romanov dynasty, the monarchy in Russia also falls. In this sense, without power, without a crown, and without allies, Tsar Nikolai III goes from the lofty, majestic position of Russian power to a path of captivity that unknowingly will lead him to his fatal end. Immediately after his abdication, Tsar Nikolai is arrested and taken to the Alexander Palace in the village of Los Ares, which is located on the outskirts of Petrobrado, previously St. Petersburg. There, the Tsar is imprisoned along with his family by order of the provisional government on March 22. Although he has no power, the Tsar is allowed to keep some of his personal belongings and have a staff of servants. Fearing him, or worse, after March 22, the Tsar requests asylum from his allied countries, France and England. However, they completely ignore the Tsar's request and leave him to his fate in Petrobrado. Months later, in August of the same year, 1914, in the midst of a power struggle between the Bolsheviks, led by the newly arrived Vladimir Lenin and the provisional government, at the harshest point of the World War, during the time of the greatest uprisings in favor of the restoration of the monarchy and worker and peasant revolts, the Tsar's family is moved to Tobolsk in Siberia, out of fear that they might be killed. In Tobolsk, a traditionally pro-monarchy area, the Romanovs have relative freedom of movement due to the small garrison guarding them. They actually form an unusual friendship with their captors. There has even been talk that in Tobolsk, the Romanovs could have escaped due to how unprotected that place was. While the Romanovs were confined in Tobolsk, major events are unfolding across the rest of Russia. In October 1917, financially supported by multiple actors from American banking and finance, and also provided with a large amount of weaponry, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and supported by the Petrograd Soviet, led by Trotsky, deliver the final blow to the provisional government formed in March. On November 8, 1917, with the capture of the Winter Palace, Petrograd was controlled. The provisional government is replaced by the so-called Council of People's Commissars, under the absolute leadership of Lenin. Thus, the Bolshevik wave spreads throughout all the major cities of European Russia and Asian Russia. But, on the other hand, in the rural interior of the vast Russian territory, the so-called white forces begin to gather. That is, the Tsarists who wanted the restoration of the monarchy, or, at least, the gathering of those who opposed the Bolshevik government. From this point on, the so-called white forces will duel with the Bolsheviks for several years in the so-called Russian Civil War, which is just beginning. In this sense, with the escalation of events in April and May of 1918, the Romanovs are transferred from Tobolsk to Yekaterinburg in central western Russia, where they are imprisoned in the so-called Ipatiev house, since supposedly the Tsar would be tried in Moscow at some point. The Ipatiev house was surrounded by a double-high wooden fence that reached above the second-floor windows of the house, which had a single door that was permanently guarded and watch posts both inside and outside the perimeter. Additionally, machine guns were installed in the attics of neighboring buildings to prevent any attempt at escape or rescue. For their part, the windows were covered with lime to prevent any view to the outside. The Romans sleep in rooms with worm-eaten furniture and eat only what the soldiers allow them. This makes them lose several kilos over months. They have no servants and can't even receive visits from the clergy for spiritual support. The soldiers treat them in a despotic and arrogant way, constantly interrogate them, and humiliate Tsar Nikolai in front of his wife and children. However, according to several biographers, Tsar Nikolai faces this situation with impassive patience, being aware of his dangerous situation and his role as the head of the family. During the endless days of confinement, the Romanovs pray according to the Orthodox rite. Do they help the cleaners with household chores? To distract themselves, they play as a family, walk through the house's narrow gardens, and care for 13-year-old Alexei, who suffers from hemophobia. The cleaners and cooks who accompanied them until they were removed by order of the Bolsheviks, they testified that despite coming from royalty, the Romanovs were, in fact, simple and humble people. That before letting themselves be defeated by adversity, they rose to the challenge and managed to come together as a family. However, their luck would change drastically in July 1918, when the white forces were heading to take Yekaterinburg. Around midnight from July 16th to 17th, supposedly by order of Lenin himself, the Bolsheviks told Tsar Nikolai to wake the Romanov family so they could quickly get dressed, claiming they were being evacuated to safety. This was due to the imminent arrival of the white forces. Quickly, Tsar Nikolai's family is taken to the basement of the house by Yakov Yurovsky, who was in charge of the Romanovs during their confinement. Shortly after, a squad from the secret police arrives in the basement, and Yurovsky reads aloud a resolution from the Executive Committee of the Urals. I quote, "Nikolai Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that your relatives continue to attack Soviet Russia, the Executive Committee of the Urals has decided to execute you." End quote. Without time to react, Tsar Nikolai, once the powerful emperor of all the Russias, turns toward his family, and quickly the squad fires a disorganized and deadly volley. Nikolai and Alexandra, the maidens Olga, Maria, Tatiana, and little Alexei, are mercilessly executed by the Bolshevik forces. After this execution, their bodies are mutilated, cut, doused in acid, and even burned, and then buried in various locations that made their discovery difficult, which only partially happened in 1979 and was fully completed in 2007, almost 100 years after the murder. The place where his father is, his mother is, and where he is, his father is, his mother is, where his father is, he is. The place where his mother is, his mother is. The place where and in the place his father is, his mother is, and in the place where his father is, and the place his father is, his mother is, and in the place where his father is, and in the place his father is. Well, the Tsar and his family were the last vestige remaining of that imperial and Christian Russia. This was driven by the findings of Nikolai Sokolov, the forensic investigator of the Romanovs' execution in 1919. Well, Kabbalistic signs, inscriptions, and strange numbers were found on the walls of the basement. The news of the murder of the Romanovs and Tsar Nikolai shocked Russia and all of Europe. It revealed the dangers of the incipient revolutionary communism that, in the following years, would take definitive control of Russia with the establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a true world power that would rival the United States until its dissolution in 1991, although forgotten for more than 80 years. For years, the physical disappearance of the Romanovs became a subject of debate again after the fall of the Soviet Union. This led to a period of more serious, less biased historical reflection, allowing the study of Tsar Nicholas, Russia's last emperor, as both a crime victim and a figure of violent transition between a Russia of centuries-old social and political structures and a different Russia, which, with communism as its slogan, flooded all the nations of the world with that revolutionary storm at the beginning of the 20th century. Even so, the impact of the monarchy and its disappearance is still present in the Russian collective imagination, where its last monarch, Tsar Nicholas III, stands out strongly as a historical figure. Thank you for watching until the end. We hope you enjoyed it. We remind you that your support is essential for the growth of this great project. That's why we invite you to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, share our content with all your friends, and stay tuned for our upcoming releases. See you next time.